I'm from a small town in northern Maine, where hunting is just as much a tradition as Thanksgiving or the 4th of July. My dad took me out hunting before I could even spell rifle, and I've been doing it since. But last October there was one hunting trip that changed everything. I've been out in those woods hundreds of times, but this time was different. I still don't have the words to explain exactly why, but maybe you'll understand by the end. My buddy Jack and I had been talking about going deeper into the woods for months. There was this spot off an old logging road by Moxie Mountain. The only people who go out there are either serious hunters or folks who get lost following some old map from the 70s. Jack insisted we'd find better game there, and though I was hesitant, he was set on it. So, early on a Saturday, we loaded up his truck, packed enough food and supplies for a couple of nights, and headed out. We got there late afternoon, and it was already turning cold. The air felt thick, the way it does just before a storm, and everything looked slightly gray, like the color had been washed out. I don't know. The place just felt wrong, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't about to say anything and let Jack start calling me paranoid. We set up camp near a small clearing and checked our gear. By dusk, we were out looking for signs of anything. Deer, maybe even some wild turkeys. But after a couple of hours, we hadn't seen a single animal, not one. I mean, usually, even if you don't spot anything, you'll at least hear something. A bird, a squirrel, anything, but it was dead silent. Jack joked about it, saying we'd probably wandered into the haunted side of the forest. He's always been the type to brush things off like that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. So we went back to camp and tried to settle in for the night. A little after midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. This soft, crunching sound, like footsteps coming closer. I glanced over at Jack, who was still dead asleep, snoring. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening, and then I saw it. Just outside our camp, a figure, tall, thin, moving slowly between the trees. My first thought was, who the hell would be out here? Whoever it was, they had no flashlight, no gear, nothing that a normal hunter or camper would carry, and the way he moved was unsettling. He'd take a few steps, stop, tilt his head, and then move again. I ducked back down, hoping he hadn't seen me. The footsteps came closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. Then, just like that, they faded away. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake, every little sound making me jump. When the first hint of daylight came, I finally got up and shook Jack awake. When I told him what I'd seen, he just laughed it off, saying it was probably some hunter out early. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't normal. I wanted to leave right then, but he convinced me to stay, saying we'd just go out for a quick morning hunt and then pack up if it'd make me feel better. I wasn't thrilled, but I agreed. That morning we trekked further into the woods, keeping quiet as we moved, rifles ready. The silence was back, and this time it felt heavier, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, around noon, we found something that made my stomach drop, a campsite. But it wasn't like ours. It was half buried in leaves, as if it had been there for weeks, maybe even months. There was an old sleeping bag, soaked and rotting, and a pile of burnt-out wood, barely recognizable as a campfire. But that wasn't the worst part. There were clothes, torn, muddy, tossed around like someone had just up and left. And on one of the trees nearby, scratched into the bark, was a word, leave. Jack tried to act tough, but I could tell he was as freaked out as I was. We both stared at that word, feeling like whoever wrote it had left it as a warning. We didn't talk about it, just nodded to each other and turned back towards camp, moving faster than I'd ever seen Jack go. When we got back, we started packing up immediately. But as we were loading up our gear, we heard something. A voice, faint but clear, calling out from the direction we'd just come from. "Hello? Hey, I'm lost!" We both froze, looking at each other. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. My gut told me something wasn't right. I whispered to him, "If he's lost, why didn't he come out last night?" The voice called out again, a little louder this time. "Can you help me?" There was something off about it. The tone. It didn't sound desperate or panicked, the way you'd expect from someone lost in the woods. It was too calm, too measured, like he was just playing a part. Jack looked at me, clearly conflicted, but he stayed quiet. We finished packing up all the while that voice kept calling, getting closer. Then, as we were about to get into the truck, we saw him. The man was standing at the edge of the clearing, that same tall, thin figure I'd seen the night before. He had this look in his eyes, like he knew something we didn't. A slow smile spread across his face, and he raised a hand in a wave as if we were old friends. "Long way from home, aren't you?" he said, his voice soft, barely loud enough to reach us. Jack, who was usually the braver one, just stared, not saying a word. Without thinking, I slammed the truck door shut and started the engine. Jack snapped out of it, fumbling to get his seatbelt on as I floored it, kicking up dirt and rocks as we sped out of there. I didn't look back, didn't want to know if he was still watching us. The whole drive home, neither of us said a word. We just kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see him in the road behind us, following. When we finally got back to town, we parked, got out, and just stood there, in silence, still trying to process what had happened. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, his smile. It's been months now, but I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. And the worst part, sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, I swear I can still hear his voice calling out, "Hey, I'm lost. I don't hunt anymore. I don't even go near the woods." And I keep wondering, what would have happened if we'd answered him? If we'd let our guard down for just a moment? I don't think I want to know.